In the winter of 1902, a ranger crouched in Pelican Valley, Yellowstone, and counted the last wild bison left on the continent, 23 animals standing in the snow. 30 million had grazed these plains within living memory. Now 23. That year, 21 more were purchased and penned at the Lamar Buffalo Ranch. Nobody who understood what had been lost believed a handful of ranch-raised animals could bring back a great herd. They were wrong. The grass in Pelican Valley had not changed. The wind moved across it the same way it always had, but the weight that once pressed that grass flat, tens of thousands of hooves in a single morning, was gone. By the late 1880s, market hunters had stripped the continent. The great herds that once blackened the plains from Texas to Montana had been reduced to bone and hide and silence. What remained in Yellowstone was not a population. It was a remnant. In 1894, Congress passed the Lacey Act. It banned hunting and the removal of wildlife from the park, because every protection that came before it had no teeth, and the poaching had not stopped. The law came too late for the continent. It came just in time for Yellowstone. The 23 animals in Pelican Valley were now the only wild bison left anywhere on Earth. The park brought in 21 animals from private ranches and placed them at the Lamar Buffalo Ranch in the Lamar Valley. Ranch-raised animals and bred under husbandry, never free. The plan was to breed them with the wild remnant until the two populations became one. Nobody called it elegant. The field teams at Lamar documented something more stubborn than elegance: a slow biological pressure. Calf by calf, season by season, the count climbing away from zero. Within roughly 5 decades, the Yellowstone herd reached 1,300 animals. The land had not forgotten the weight. The grass bent again the way it used to. But then the managers stepped in. For decades, the park ran active culling programs, removing animals, controlling numbers, deciding how many bison the land was allowed to hold. The herd had survived the hunters. Now it had to survive the plan. By 1970, the managed population stood at 500. 2 decades later, after the culling moratorium began, it reached 3,000. The difference was not a better funding cycle. It was simply stopping. Between 1985 and 2000, roughly 3,100 bison were killed as they moved beyond the park boundary in winter. The herd kept growing anyway. That is the part that does not fit the model. A population absorbing that level of removal and still climbing. The grasslands were ready. The soil remembered the pressure of hooves. The question nobody has fully answered is what exactly inside those 23 animals was stubborn enough to carry an entire species back from the edge of arithmetic. The stubbornness inside those survivors was genetic, yes, but the land beneath them carried its own version of the same thing. Pelican Valley's floor still held the shallow depressions where wallows had been churned for 10,000 years. No animal was deepening them anymore. The shapes persisted anyway. A wallow is not just a mud hole. It is a micro-habitat, a basin that collects snow melt, holds standing water through the dry months, and feeds a chain of insects, shorebirds, and amphibians that have no other source of that geometry. When the churning stopped, the chain began to fray from the bottom up. In the Lamar Valley, the grass grew tall and undisturbed. To almost any observer that looked like recovery, it was not. Tall, unbroken grass on this range meant the soil beneath it was compacting wrong, sealing over, shedding the disturbance that certain seed beds require to germinate at all. The landscape had become its own slow illusion. Here is what that absence looked like across the 4 zones the surveys documented. Wallows collapsed, waterlines retreating each dry season, grass height rising, seedbed disturbance falling to nothing. Soil compression absent for the first time in millennia, the surface hardening in ways water could no longer penetrate. Migration corridors fenced shut, the few dozen remaining animals moving in contracted loops with no memory of scale. That boundary fence is the detail that carries the most weight. The open corridors that once moved hundreds of thousands of animals across the region had been replaced by private fields. The remnant had no route. More than that, it had no inherited knowledge of what a route at that scale had ever meant. The Lamar Buffalo Ranch, established after the 1902 purchase, was not placed there by accident. The valley's grass, despite its misleading height, still sat on soil that had once known the weight of enormous movement. The program's managers were betting that the memory inside the land could be reactivated, that the right pressure, returned to the right place, would restart something structural. What no one had formally measured at the time was how long a grassland ecosystem can hold that ghost architecture. The dormant seed banks, the dry wallow basins, the hardened trail lines, before the substrate shifts past the point of return. The surveys recorded where the loss was happening. They did not record how much time remained. That is the unresolved fact sitting inside the recovery story. The interagency Bison management plan eventually documented a population ranging between 2,400 and 6,000 animals across the greater Yellowstone system. The wallows are being churned again, the trails are being pressed again, but whether the seed beds that thinned quietly over those silent decades came back with them, that the field teams have not yet closed. The land looked like wilderness through all of it. It was a wilderness running on memory alone. And memory, it turns out, is a more durable substrate than anyone managing a crisis on paper had any reason to expect. The Lamar Buffalo Ranch did not look like salvation. It was a cluster of log buildings set against a cold Wyoming ridgeline, feed troughs, fenced paddocks, the smell of domestic animals in a wild park. What it was, in fact, was the first time any government on this continent had tried to rebuild a wild species from a managed breeding nucleus. The Lacey Act had given the park its enforcement teeth. Poachers who had once walked out of Yellowstone without consequence now faced federal prosecution. But a law without animals to protect is scaffolding around an empty building. The 1894 legislation drew the line. The 1902 purchase put something back behind it. The program's managers bought 21 bison from private ranchers, a figure that would strike any modern conservation biologist as almost impossibly thin for a viable founding population. Those animals were bred under husbandry, fed through the winters, protected from predators, their calves counted and recorded. Gradually, season by season, the ranch-raised animals were walked out toward Pelican Valley, where the wild remnant still held on. The two populations did not merge dramatically. They simply, over time, stopped being separate. The inherited puzzle, how a population absorbing that scale of removal kept climbing anyway, is one the surveys record without fully resolving. The ranch nucleus supplied the numbers. What it could not supply was an explanation for why the merged herd exceeded every projection drawn up around it. The field notes document the trajectory. The mechanism behind the resilience, the program's biologists never isolated. The herd grew. Within half a century of the ranch purchase, it had climbed past what the park's founding managers had thought possible. Growth, it turned out, was not the end of the problem. It was the beginning of the next one. Officials decided the Northern Range could not carry the numbers. The culling program that followed ran for 15 years. And when the moratorium finally arrived in 1969, the managed population had been pushed back down to roughly 500 animals. The men with the rifles had nearly done what the market hunters failed to finish. Then the culling stopped. What the program's managers did not predict was how fast the herd responded once the pressure lifted. Within 2 decades, the count reached 3,000, a number that had seemed structurally impossible to the officials who had spent a generation trying to hold the ceiling down. That recovery was not uniform across the greater ecosystem. The Northern Range responded faster than the interior. The migration corridors at the park boundary remained contested. Ranchers, state agencies and federal managers, each drawing a different line across the same ground. The herd that rebuilt from 21 purchased animals was now pressing outward against fences that had no interest in its history. What nobody has yet measured with any precision is whether the vegetation communities outside those fences, reshaped by a century without large-scale bison movement, can absorb a herd of this size moving through them again, or whether the corridors themselves have changed too fundamentally to carry the weight of the recovery they made possible. The surveys record the result, not the cause, but the physical sequence is legible in the soil itself. When the grazing pressure lifted, the Northern Range did not simply rest. It waited, structurally coiled, for the one thing that could release it. Each animal that moves across a dry grassland carries close to a ton of weight on hooves shaped to punch through surface crust. That punch is not damage. It is tillage, seed pressed into mineral earth, moisture held in the broken surface rather than lost to evaporation. The wallows came back first. Rolling animals scrape shallow bowls into the earth, and those bowls fill with snowmelt. Within seasons, invertebrate communities that depend on standing water in a dry grassland began recolonizing them. Insects, larvae, the small wet architecture of a functioning system. The grazing itself worked in patches, not sheets. Grasses cropped unevenly in one zone, left rank and tall in another, created a mosaic. Short growth stages beside long ones, bare mineral soil beside standing thatch. That mosaic is exactly what a diverse plant community requires. From above, the Northern Range had looked uniform for decades, a flat green canvas with no texture to read. Now it began resolving into something else. Relief, variation. The signature of an animal that had been doing this work for 10,000 years before anyone tried to stop it. From roughly 500 individuals in 1970, the Yellowstone count reached 3,000 by 1990. No manager had set that number as a target. The land absorbed the recovery because the structure to run it had never fully collapsed. It had only been interrupted. The land had not forgotten. It had simply been on hold. But the vegetation communities outside the boundary fences tell a different story. A century without large-scale movement across those corridors had not left them neutral. Shrub encroachment, altered soil crusts, the collapse of certain grass species, changes that accumulate quietly without a visible event to mark them. The field teams working those transition zones have documented the shifts in plant composition. What they have not resolved is the threshold question. How much structural degradation a corridor can sustain before it can no longer transmit the grazing mosaic that makes recovery self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting. That threshold has not been measured. The count inside the boundary climbed because the system there was intact enough to respond. Whether the land beyond the fence line is still capable of the same response, that is the question the recovery has not yet answered, and the one that determines what this story actually means. The fence line meant nothing to them. Winter pressed down from the high plateau, and the animals moved the way their ancestors had always moved, downhill toward lower elevation, toward warmth. A boundary drawn on a federal map carries no scent, no sound, no signal a bison is built to detect. The surveys that later tracked vegetation outside the park's borders told part of this story, but not all of it. What the field teams documented was a result. Animals moving along corridors their ancestors had used for thousands of years, without isolating why those same corridors, reshaped by a century of cattle and road and subdivision, still transmitted that pull at all. The mechanism was real. It simply was not fully recorded. Between 1985 and 2000, roughly 3,100 bison were killed as they crossed or attempted to cross outside the park's borders. Park managers, state authorities, tribal hunts. The pressure came from every direction at once. The stated justification was brucellosis, a bacterial disease the herd carried, which ranchers argued could transfer to cattle grazing the same ground. The livestock industry carried enough political weight to ensure that concern was treated as settled science, even where transmission risk under real field conditions remained genuinely contested among researchers. The bison did not stop. A temperature gradient pulling an animal toward bare, wind-scoured grass at lower elevation is not a policy argument. It is a physical fact, rehearsed across 10,000 winters before the first fence post was ever driven into this ground. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The animals pressing the boundary were not lost, not diseased, not displaced by overcrowding. They were doing exactly what a recovered population does, behaving as though the landscape their biology was shaped by still existed, because in their nervous systems it did. The Interagency Bison Management Plan eventually brought state, federal and tribal authorities into a shared framework. It did not resolve the tension, it structured it, set terms for when removal was permitted, created space for tribal harvest, and acknowledged that a wild population this size would not be contained by paperwork alone. Since that framework took effect, the population has moved between 2,400 and 6,000 animals, depending on the year. That span is not instability. It is the signature of a wild population responding to real ecological variables, winter severity, available forage, the pressure of management decisions that have not stopped. What the plan has not resolved, and what no management document yet addresses, is whether the tribal, state and federal authorities that share governance of this herd share the same answer to a harder question. How much of the original migration range is still biologically available to bison, and what happens to the population's long-term structure if that range stays closed? From 23 animals surviving in a single high valley to a herd that now strains against the edges of one of the largest protected areas on the continent, that arc is extraordinary. But a herd pressing a fence is also a herd telling you something about the size of the world it needs and whether the world you have built around it is large enough to hold what you saved. What the survey's record is the rate. The culling years removed tens of thousands of individuals over decades, and the recovery absorbed every reduction and kept climbing. The programme's biologists never isolated a single mechanism. The count rose, and the cause remained distributed, written across the grass, the soil microbiome, the calving intervals, and a gene pool that was narrower than anyone had hoped, but apparently wide enough to hold. That is what biological resilience actually looks like when you see it in the data rather than in a nature film. It does not announce itself. It just keeps outpacing the pressure applied against it, quietly, season after season, until the graph stops making sense to the people who designed the management model. The Lamar Buffalo Ranch is still standing in the Lamar Valley. You can walk through it. The corrals where ranch-raised offspring were bred into the free-roaming remnant are still there. Weathered, functional, ordinary-looking. Nothing about them suggests they are the physical site where a species was pulled back across the line. This is not a miracle story. It is a removal story. Remove the killing pressure, leave the structure intact, and the system does not need to be rebuilt. It only needs to be allowed. The grassland was still there. The calving behaviour was still encoded. The migration memory, compressed, attenuated, but not erased, was still moving through the surviving lineage. What remains unresolved is not the recovery itself, but the ceiling above it. The landscape the surviving lineage is fitted for extends far beyond any boundary the management plan currently recognises. Whether the governance structures that now share this species can agree on how much of that original range to reopen, that negotiation is still live, and the land is not waiting for it to conclude. I have watched rivers come back from agricultural dead zones. I have watched raptors return to valleys that had not seen them in 2 generations. The pattern is the same every time. The system was not broken. It was suppressed. Stop the suppression, and the machinery underneath starts again. Not always completely, not always in the original form, but recognisably, stubbornly alive. Tell me where you are. Drop your region in the comments and name one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your own lifetime. Not from a textbook, from memory. And yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. What Yellowstone demonstrates, with counted, documented, contested, argued over data, is that permanence was never the correct diagnosis. Suppression was, and suppression can end. The next chapter follows the grey wolf, reintroduced into that same Yellowstone landscape in 1995, and what its return did to the course of the rivers themselves. The US livestock industry fought that reintroduction in court through the 1990s, and in 2008, a federal judge ruled the removal of wolves from the endangered species list unlawful and ordered them restored to full protection. A legal reversal that measures exactly how much was at stake and how hard the resistance held. The question that reintroduction has not fully answered is whether a predator, once restored, can be politically sustained in a landscape where it and human livelihoods share the same ground. The land does not negotiate, it just responds.